Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. We're going to let people enter the Zoom room first, though. So give us just a minute to let folks join, and we'll be kicking off. All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation. My name is Mallory Batchus. I'm the Director of Strategic Development for CNU, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations that thought leaders in urbanism and allied industries can have. It provides a platform, and it provides the opportunity for the audience to engage in real time with these speakers. This webinar series is intended to be a platform for CNU members to debate and collaborate on pressing and emerging issues that we're all facing right now. So we welcome feedback and suggestions on topics that might be relevant that you'd like to hear in this webinar series. So please reach out to us. Today's conversation, however, is called CNU29.Design for Policy Change. I'm here with Harriet Tregoning, Hayden Blackwalker, and Mark Wooters, and I'll be moderating the session today. And the purpose of today's topic is to get folks excited about CNU29. If you aren't already registered, CNU29.Design for Change is our upcoming Congress. And in that Congress, we have 3 tracks of sessions that we'll be offering. Those tracks are policy change, physical change, and social change. And today's webinar is an opportunity to get you excited and talk a little more about why there is a need for design for policy change and why we have a track based on this at the Congress. CNU29.Design for Change will be our last virtual Congress, knock on wood. And it offers 5 days of programming around the new and ongoing issues that cities face in these extraordinary times of change. The registration rates are the lowest they have been. You'll be able to collect professional continuing education credits, as you always can, and you'll have access to the session archives for 6 months afterwards. So it's an incredible opportunity to connect with fellow Urbanists, to learn and to share, and I hope everyone will join us May 17th through the 21st. Registration is on the CNU website. I also want to let you know about upcoming webinars that we have for the On the Park Bench series. Next Tuesday, April 27th, we'll be holding CNU29.Design for Physical Change, and we'll be doing this same sort of preview of what to expect of the topics and conversations at CNU29. That session will be moderated by Garland Woodsong and will include Nathan Norris from the New Urban Guild and Camille Cortez of the Place Initiative. Both of which will be participating in the Congress this year. On Tuesday, May 4th, I'm very excited about this. The Authors Forum will celebrate the 50th anniversary of Life Between Buildings, Jan Gehl's very well-known book. Jan is a Athena Medal winner from CNU and is an extraordinary speaker and author and thinker, and I think you'll really enjoy that webinar. And then finally, on Tuesday, May 11th, CNU29.Design for Social Change will be our topic. Todd Zimmerman will be moderating that session, and Karen Perolik, Marquez King, and Jennifer Hurley will be participating and talking about the ways in which the sessions they're participating in at CNU29 will tee up those conversations. You can always, as always, you can register for these future On the Park Bench webinars at our website, as you can see on the link on the screen. So today, let me tell you about who we have with us. I'm very excited about this. Harriet Tregoning is the director of NUMO, the New Urban Mobility Alliance, hosted by the WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. Harriet has been deeply engaged on planning smart mobility, disaster resilience, housing, and community development issues over the past 2 decades, working with organizations around the country to help states and localities prepare for a range of future challenges. Prior to NUMO, she served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Office of Community Planning and Development in the Obama administration. And before that was the long tenured director of the DC Office of Planning. Hayden Black Walker is Director of Planning for Black and Bernoulli Architecture and Urban Design. Together with Sinclair Black, she co-founded Reconnect Austin, a community-based call to lower the main lanes of I-35 through Austin's urban core, creating a vision of a reconnected city fabric which provides multimodal access to housing, jobs, medical facilities, and transit. Hayden is a 2016 fellow and mentor for the National Walking College. And Mark Wooters is a leader in the design process for new communities, downtown master plans, resiliency planning, affordable housing, and various architectural projects. He directs Mark Wooters Studios. His body of work includes Empire State Development's Downtown Revitalization Initiative, the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway Transformation, the City of Saskatoon City Center Master Plan, the Brooklyn Navy Yard Resiliency Plan, and the award-winning Columbia Heights, Washington, D.C. Master Plan, as well as South Jamaica Cloudburst Plan. He previously served as a partner at Cooper Robertson and Partners and Torty Gallis and Partners. And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and hand this over to Harriet, who's going to begin with a bit of a presentation or conversation really about the reasons that she's bringing these topics to CNU 29 and her perspective on the need for design for policy change. Harriet?
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to have this conversation with Hayden and Mark and you, Mallory. This, I can't tell you, maybe it's the spring, maybe it's our rate of vaccination. I'm just getting very excited about the corner that I hope we're about to turn. And it has been a really, really long 13 months. With COVID, really being such a phenomenon that most of us have never, the likes of which most of us have never lived through. It's been an accelerator of so many trends that were already underway. Think about, the precarious nature of on-street retail, bricks and mortar retail. Think about deliveries and e-commerce. Think about the ability to work from home. Just things that we thought couldn't be possible so quickly have really happened, and how so many cities have transformed streets and land uses at a speed that we never would have thought possible. But one of the really striking things was how vividly COVID highlighted the inequality of our economy and the growing disparity, across the country. It was, visible in every community. And while COVID certainly made it visible for decades, that's a trend that had been in existence and been accelerating. Transportation is one of the fields where this really played out. I mean, just kind of think about it. The COVID really exacerbated people's existing transportation challenges, but also created a whole bunch of new ones. The crisis in public transit, the fear of transit, concerns about health and safety, but also the dramatic drop in transit service in so many places. And we had that vivid reminder of who relies on transit. Well, it turns out most of the workers that are critical to our functioning, especially during the pandemic. Who got to work from home? Who got to see their stock portfolios increase in value? Who lost their job or lost their hours? Who saw their kids struggle without reliable access to any broadband keep up in school? those differences are really big. People lost jobs, lost hours, lost vehicles that they were paying on. Bottom line, who prospered, who fell behind? It's an exacerbation of that existing trend and greater disparities. Um, much of the job loss associated with the COVID pandemic was among hourly wage workers, whether that's an actual job loss in industries that were hard hit like hospitality, or whether that was a reduction in hours, a diminution. These are the same workers who are much more likely to be dependent on transit, who are much less likely to own reliable vehicles if they own them. But it also means that their access to jobs as they look for new or better jobs is so much more limited. So I think a big challenge is how cities are going to pivot from reacting to COVID to really refocusing on how to provide transportation, how to organize our neighborhoods while prioritizing more equitable outcomes and taking into account some of the things that we've learned from the past year about how we can do things differently, how we can do things more quickly. And I'll just say, one of the things I hope we can really talk about that I'm very excited about is that in the new administration, both with the American Rescue Act and now with the American Jobs Plan, we see an administration who seems to get that these things are really connected. And I'd love to have a little bit of a policy conversation going forward about what those connections are. What does this have to do with the CNU? And how can CNU members get really involved in helping their communities prepare for the opportunities that are already appearing even before there's any bill or appropriation associated with the American Jobs Plan? This is the blueprint that the Biden administration looks poised to fully implement with their existing funding, with their existing programs. So I think we'll have a lot of fun talking about those opportunities.
Thanks so much, Harriet. And so leading straight from that, Hayden, do you want to give a little bit of your thoughts and overview of your why to CNU 29 Design for Policy Change?
Yeah, I would be happy to do that. I'm Hayden Black-Walker. Thanks for having me here today. Can everybody see the screen okay? So I put together a little bit of a slide deck just to kind of talk through past highway policy and future highway policy that is needed going forward. For almost a decade, Reconnect Austin has been proposing a better solution for I-35. The Texas Department of Transportation, TxDOT, intends to completely rebuild it. So I'm going to use I-35 as a little bit of an example of what's going on here, but really we find that the same issues are happening in all cities in Texas and really across the country. Each DOT and state are a little bit different, but we really need a better set of policies to shift the paradigm around highways. So it's really important that we're talking about highways now, because we really have this situation where we have these big highways through American cities. They're reaching the end of their lifespan. Something needs to be done, and we need to be making a better set of choices before we lock ourselves into another 60 years of major infrastructure. So we have this once in a lifetime opportunity. This is what, in Austin, we used to have primarily streets. This is East Avenue that eventually became I-35. And given all that we know about past policies and the damage that we know that highways do to cities and really climate change, we really question why we're still continuing to build highways and why, at least in Texas, we're continuing to significantly widen them. So I was going to do a little bit of history of the highway system. It was the biggest single capital improvement project ever in the history of the world at the time. We made the same mistakes basically everywhere. We built the same thing everywhere in a short period of time. We made it really difficult to get around without a car. We intentionally exported wealth to the suburbs. We polluted the air, and we devalued adjacent land, and we induced a whole lot of demand to create sprawl. So we're finally starting to acknowledge some of those racist policies. I was going to show this just as an example. This is what was East Avenue in Austin. So you can look at any redlining map in the United States and see where highways were going to be placed. So prior to the 1920s in Austin, there were freedmen's communities all across the city. This is East Austin. All Black people were forced by the 1928 plan to move into this neighborhood. It was then redlined, and I-35 was put right here along this edge. And most of the property taken for the highway was taken out of East Austin. And so we really need to have a conversation about the generational wealth that was lost in this scenario. Land along this corridor was bought for less than $1 a square foot, and that land is worth over $200 a square foot today. So you can see here the land that was taken for the highway. And this is what it became today. And we are making some better choices across the United States, and we can all learn from these projects in the United States and around the world to create better policy. So I want to fast forward to today and talk a little bit about some of the problems about where we are and what we need to be thinking about. TxDOT, well, you know, I already said, but we need to understand the severe impacts on these communities, including the loss of generational wealth. This is feedback from a scoping working group on I-35 that is made up of primarily of communities of color. TxDOT is not listening to anything that was said here. They're completely ignoring what's going on. They need to listen, and we need policies that make DOTs listen to local communities. Austin's one of the fastest growing cities in the country, and we have a severe housing shortage. And yet we rarely step back and look at the inefficient ways that we use land for highways and the amount of housing and city that we could put in those same spaces. TxDOT likes to say that this project will solve congestion. We know that it won't. The Congestion Con report is a really great tool to show people that in every case where highway lane miles were added, congestion actually got worse. This is the Katy Freeway in Houston, which TxDOT spent billions of dollars widening to 26 lanes. Congestion is worse than ever. And recently TxDOT said they're going to add more lanes to this highway. And the modeling that's used to justify these projects is really way off. I've put a link up here to a smart mobility report about I-35, and the modeling was used. Basically, they're just projecting traffic will increase 2% every year ad infinitum. And you can see that even though they project over 300,000 trips a day, over and over again, you can't fit all those cars on this highway unless you actually widen it. So this is what they want to do. They want to widen to 20 lanes. I see Mark laughing through the urban core of Austin and through the University of Texas. And they say that that will solve congestion. And we have policies in place. Austin has a really great Vision Zero policy. The state has a great Vision Zero policy, but widening to 20 lanes with a design speed of 70 miles an hour through a highly urbanized area in a university is not likely to reduce traffic fatalities. 25% of the fatalities we have in the entire city of Austin happen in this single corridor. And TxDOT is a state where the FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration, has ceded all their environmental authority to the state. So the state creates the project, they hire the environmental consultants, and then they approve their own project, which is turning out to be a real problem. In Houston, I-45 is a very similar project to I-35. TxDOT plans to bulldoze over 1,000 homes and businesses, 5 houses of worship, and 2 schools, all primarily in communities of color. This is in the 21st century. In Houston did propose a community plan. TxDOT has ignored it. So now the county has sued TxDOT, and FHWA has stopped the project to investigate civil rights violations. And we really need policies in place where we can actually consider community alternatives. There are 3 community alternatives, including Reconnect Austin for I-35, and TxDOT is ignoring all of them and has for the last over 8 years. We're hoping that better federal policy will be put in place. Secretary Buttigieg is definitely saying really great things. And the bills that are being put before Congress will have a really big impact. But we need a lot of policy change at the local, state, and federal levels. So I hope you'll join us for the 2 Highways to Boulevards sessions at CNU 29. And with that, I'll say thank you and hand it over to Mark.
Thank you. I'm Mark Wooters. I actually wasn't planning on sharing this, but after seeing Hayden's presentation, I actually also have been looking at highway transformations. And this is the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, which it carries, 150,000 vehicles a day. Goes through a lot of minority neighborhoods. And really in a lot of highway discussions, we've been looking at the impact on minority neighborhoods. If you make a nice boulevard, there's a lot of discussion about displacing existing minority neighborhoods that are there. And so that leads me to what I'm really here to talk about today is affordable housing and community land trusts. We've also noticed in the major cities this amazing period of immigration into our big cities. And it's been great in terms of job creation. But what has been extremely difficult for so many is the rise in housing costs, the lack of affordability, and it's particularly been stressful on minority communities, low-income communities. We've been looking at strategies to really protect them. I hear the screaming. I've worked in minority communities for 20 years. I work with public housing residents, and I really keep tabs on people on what people are saying. And people are saying it's just not that I'm afraid that I'm going to have to leave my neighborhood. They're seeing their whole neighborhood being eliminated. Everything they've invested in that neighborhood, the small stores. So for me as an urban planner, it really is distressing to see, really interesting neighborhoods that just can't keep up with the economic pressures of the city. What one event particularly that impressed me is I went down after Hurricane Maria to Puerto Rico. And were people talking about flooding? Yes. Were people talking about the power outage, of half the island? Yes. People were talking about gentrification. And I thought, wow, even here, and in San Juan, there's a lot of sort of waterfront communities that have displaced the minority communities. And what they did was they established a community land trust. And there's been one functioning here in New York City for 60 years. It was set up when Robert Moses threatened to bulldoze over part of the East Village, and it's healthy and it's in operation. So what a community land trust does is a community can actually own a group of the ground under a group of buildings, or maybe it's many buildings. It depends on the city and the situation. But it sets up a nonprofit. And what that means is that if you rent in it, even though there's land speculation around you in your neighborhood, your rents don't go up because it's a nonprofit. The community sets what the rents need to be. And so the rents only really need to go up in order for increased maintenance costs or things like that that start going up over time. But it gives people relative stability. So I find it very interesting. And alongside then highway projects, well, and so we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later, it provides an opportunity for people to participate in newly, improved transportation corridors and really establish, a full picture of a community. I thought a great idea would be for people to hear directly from stakeholders. And I've made a little film where you can really hear from people what they're experiencing firsthand, better than secondhand from me.
One and a half million people.
The entire city of Philadelphia is 1.5 million people. We added that in 20 years in New York. The immigration boom that we're still going through is bigger than what happened during Ellis Island.
The wealth of the world focused on New York. While so many have benefited from this growth, the intense competition over land and housing has proved extremely challenging for many existing communities.
The history of communities of color throughout the history of the United States are very similar to what occurs now, right? With like displacement, moving, not having a choice, establishing community, having it become cool and like awesome, and giving birth to movements like hip hop, and then having other people be like, I want that, and then just them being able to have it.
I've been displaced before. I've been in a situation where I was told you had to leave this place even though you were born and raised here, and you can never come back here again.
It's not our neighborhood anymore. It's not.
The Bronx is the last reasonably priced area and the cheapest borough where people can find reasonable places to live. And everybody flocked here when they were pushed out of the other areas, out of the other boroughs. Now they're coming for the Bronx.
This affordability crisis threatens who we are, threatens the very soul of this city.
Many older communities created social networks, support systems, and cultural activities that connect them.
Everybody knew everybody. Everybody used to sit out on their front stoops, old people, young people. Well, now it's 100% different. People change here every day. People move in, they're here for 6 months. 6 months later, they're gone. Someone else is here. It's a whole different world now.
Residents gather to develop ways to stabilize their communities.
We are not fundamentally opposed to growth in East New York. That's not what this is about. But the question always has to be, who benefits from this growth?
Right? Like if you have new folks in a neighborhood and folks from the older neighborhood or who've been here for a long time, you know, what do? You meet each other, you build trust, you have conversations, you share stories, you know, like you build with what you have now.
Do you think there's anything that New York City government planning agencies could help you with?
I'd like to be able to find a place where I could stay and know that I don't have to, in 6 years, it's going to change.
One potential strategy is the community land trust.
The community should be owning their community.
A community land trust is grounded in the idea that you want the land to be owned and controlled by the people who live in a community.
By the people, for the people.
Okay, so that gives you a little bit of a sense of, you know, what I hear pretty frequently. And, you know, before we get to questions, you know, I just want to impress upon people that job growth is really great and beneficial, but, you know, you think of members of the community who not only are they personally concerned about being displaced, they're seeing all of their neighbors starting to leave. And it's happening relatively quickly. And then there's small stores starting to leave. On top of that, many of these communities have invested in building those communities for 30 years. They built those small stores and everything that's now perceived as cute, let's move in. So the stress level is quite high. And you have to think of the toll it takes on emotional health of people. Think of seniors who lose their support systems. Think of children who benefit from being in a stable home. So, you know, that's, and so at CNU on the 21st of May, we will have 4 expert panelists who run community land trusts and they're going to tell you everything about them that you need to know. They're from Atlanta, they're from New York. There's a national organization that fosters them. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you, Mark. That was great. And it tees up a question I want to ask, but I am going to remind all of the audience that if you'd like to ask questions of the panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and you can send your questions directly. I'll be helping to tee those up to our panelists today. But the first question I wanted to ask in it to the group, and Mark, you sort of set it up well with that video that you shared there at the end. You know, we're on the one hand, this session and y'all's expertise comes at the level of policy, which can be very much, you know, the 30,000-foot view of these challenges. And then at the same time, as the video you showed, Mark, points out, that these are real people's lives that are being impacted by these policies. And it made me think of, in our prep call yesterday, Harriet, you brought this up, the challenge of investment, that, you know, even something like a bike lane can be destabilizing for a community. And yet the policy itself of adding bike lanes is something that many communities would strive to include. And so I wanted to tee up this question of how new urbanists, many of us work in the realm of design, and that design may reach towards policy or it may reach towards the individual community or both. And I wanted to ask y'all, in what ways in each of your own expertise you see opportunities for change in policy, and ways that new urbanists, as in that realm that we work in very many different industries within the big umbrella of new urbanism, could you talk about the ways that you see new urbanists being able to participate more successfully in the policy changes that we're talking about, and for the sort of outcomes, the better outcomes for communities, as Mark's video pointed out, that we want to see as a result of policy change?
I'll start to break the silence. I mean, there's policy at so many levels. So you might really want to think about approaching it from, you know, a local community level, the federal level, you know, what can the states do? And, you know, if there's any public-private partnerships that can be structured to sort of, you know, leverage investments money to help some of this work. You know, at the local level, New York City is looking at a number of programs to support affordable housing. But like I said, while there's a lot of different types of ways to fund affordable housing, it really is about the neighborhood as well. You really have to look at that neighborhood scale, because that's sort of, you know, having that person wave to you on the street when you're walking to work or getting something, that, you know, all that sort of knowledge and support system that you get is critical for people. You know, we've been looking at things like putting flip taxes on various districts so that people can't just buy a home, flip it, and take all the money. Some of that money has to be reinvested in the community. You know, we've been looking at public-private partnerships to build more affordable housing. We have a mandatory inclusionary housing requirement for several zones here in New York City. But I do wonder, at a federal level, since there's going to be probably federal funding needs to be for a lot of these bigger highway projects, does there need to be something done so that we really are engaging multiple agencies to look at the whole neighborhood, not just the highway transformation, and really be supportive of that whole neighborhood? So
I think this starts, you talk about federal policy, and I'd love to have that conversation about what are the things that the federal government has announced that will be driving their own funding decisions. But I do think the things that places could be doing right now to get themselves organized really helps to prepare those units of government, whether they're state, regional, or local, for federal funds. And that does mean probably organizing conversations that are that cross sectors, So if you're going to be looking at removing a freeway or making, making part of it a boulevard, right? That is likely to spur a particular kind of investment, right? So what can you do to look at who's vulnerable to, who's already, who has tenure in the land that is likely to be affected by that decision, and what can you do by partnering with a community land trust, by partnering with government? What are the government-owned parcels? What could be used to ensure that folks could stay there or have a stake in whatever is coming. So, I mean, I think in the Obama administration, HUD, EPA, and DOT had a sustainable communities partnership, and they probably talked more closely with each other. Shelley Patricia led some of that effort than at any other time in the federal government. I think that around climate and around equity and racial justice, they're going to be very similar conversations and discussions. And I think that in some ways, it's kind of good to think about the money, right? So there are enormous amounts of money finally associated with climate mitigation, doing things to invest in things that prevent the really most dreadful impacts of extreme weather associated with climate change. A lot of the things that help prevent damage are things that also can make communities more stable long-term. That might mean diversifying your transportation offering. So if the Katy Highway is jammed with cars or flooded, that people can be on bikes to get where they need to go, or they have other means of transportation. I think it's very telling in the American Jobs Plan that the discussion involves no expansion of roads, but lots of expansion of transit, right? One of the things that new urbanists understand as well as anyone is the degree to which we've substituted automobility for proximity. And there's nothing like proximity, both for creating the kind of neighborhoods Hayden and Mark are talking about, but also for really lowering your transportation costs, increasing your affordability in a community, and making it possible to access your daily needs in a way that doesn't require, buying, a $20,000 or $30,000 depreciating durable good, right, in order to be part of the economy. So I think some of the organizing around it you could start to do right now and make the connections between resilience, between climate change, between new infrastructure investment, between housing security, because I think the ears of the federal government have never been more open to that. But I do have one caution. Hayden showed us some redlining maps. One of the things that's absolutely coming, climate change and disaster, that is both the new redlining and the new urban renewal. Because poor people in every city and every community live on cheap land, the cheapest land, the lowest lying land, the most vulnerable land. Even if their communities are wonderfully intact, there could very well come a point where it's not possible, not tenable for them to stay there. And where's the big open land that's conveniently located to transit, jobs, and amenities that we can move neighborhoods to? Well, there isn't any.
Right.
Unless we think now about how to look for those obsolete land uses, look for those opportunities to get people to safety on higher ground who are most vulnerable. But that is a challenge that's absolutely ahead of us that I think almost nobody is thinking about.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. This is a really thorny situation. And when we talk about rebuilding I-35 and potentially mitigating some of the impacts, or even, there's a group that proposes to remove it through the urban core, which would probably be even, a better solution. We could build affordable housing. We could put people closer to our thriving downtown and our state capitol complex and the university. But you know, in Texas, at least, we are so limited. We aren't even allowed to have inclusionary zoning. You know, the tools in our toolbox are so limited. East Austin has already been heavily gentrified. There's been an enormous amount of displacement, and doing anything better in this corridor has a lot of pros and cons. You know, it probably will accelerate displacement unless we put the right tools in place. And I don't know about other states, but here our DOT, you know, basically says our job is to build highways. Don't talk to us about racism and displacement and gentrification and housing policy and all that other stuff. You know, so it becomes a very thorny issue to try to figure out how to solve. And I don't think we have any good answers yet, really.
Yeah, I think it would be a great conversation. We had a great commissioner, Polly Trottenberg, head of transportation here in New York City, who now has just been confirmed, and she's sitting alongside Pete Buttigieg. And when the Brooklyn Queens Expressway really was at a crisis point a couple of years ago to repair, and there was a plan proposed that was not community friendly in any way, shape, or form, I was trustful that we could have a discussion with her at the helm about how to do something that was more sensitive to neighborhoods. But I do find there's an element of our transportation engineering force, which people are responsibly doing their jobs. We've been trained to convey people and not have traffic jams, because if there's traffic jams, then they call everybody calls the politicians, and you know, they're all fearful of those calls. So it is, we all have to look at this period as educating people who are going to be working on these infrastructure projects to think, you know, more broadly, or do partnerships with, you know, urban planning and other aspects.
So let's not forget, like I said, start at the local level. I didn't say end at the local level.
Right.
So one of the big things that's happening is the federal government is saying, you know what? There's not enough money, even in the federal government. Even when we're using, you know, dollars that end with T's, right? Our dollar amounts, you know, in the trillions of dollars. It's not enough to do even the infrastructure part of what we're talking about. So they're really looking to try to swing formula dollars, right? So they'll have discretionary money, but they want to swing the formula dollars, like money that currently goes by formula to states in the highway program. They want to swing state and local dollars. 1 to 2 to 3%, depending on the year, of GDP is spent by states and localities on their capital budgets. And the federal government is basically saying, we have enough money to put on the stump, you know, that we can really reward the places that are pulling in the same direction and not reward the places that are going at doing something that's at odds with what we're trying to do. So that is influential to local governments, to states, you know, and one of the big problems is in federalism, the federal government gives money mostly to the states, a constitutionally recognized entity, not so much to local governments.
Right.
I mean, when I worked at HUD, you know, the only reason HUD does disaster recovery is not because people care so much about the housing, although they should. It's because we already have relationships at HUD with basically every unit of local government, right? So that pathway exists to send the money post-disaster. But the states aren't ever sub-allocating their money in a way that encourages localities to use their land use tools. Well, at the end of the Obama administration, some of you might have seen something that came out of the White House about housing development toolkit. It was a way of talking about zoning and restrictions on land use that only kind of touched on the issue of redlining, or I'll put it this way, exclusionary zoning practices. In every city virtually in the US, no matter how urban, an enormous quantity of land is zoned for single families only on large detached lots. And that practice began to exclude, to exclude families of color, to exclude Jews, to exclude immigrants. And that legacy exists and continues. In a lot of places, the map that Hayden showed You could show it for Baltimore. It looks exactly the same. You could show it for St. Louis. The land pattern is the same today as it was at the end of the 1920s, right? So what the federal government is trying to do is to use their money, right, to both show people a different way to do things, a more inclusive way to do things, to invest in the transportation that we need that will increase access instead of worrying just about congestion. So all the things, Hayden, you were talking about, those are the very attitudes that they want to try to overcome. So I think, you know, preparing some enlightened part, even if it's only to hedge, you know, like let's submit 2 proposals, one the old way, one the new way. Let's see what gets funded, and that will send a really important signal about how people want to do it differently. And no matter what Texas could do in the next 4 years or 8 years, it can't reverse, you know, the incredible autocentricity of the state. So maybe they're willing to try something, you know, in specific places that's a little different if it means that they can get some funding. And honestly, getting people out of their cars would do a lot to solve congestion problems in many parts of Texas. But I'm just saying that everybody has the issue you're talking about, but for a change, the federal government is interested in actually using carrots big enough to be sticks, you know, to get changes in state and local policy. That's how I'm reading it.
Mhm.
Yeah, it definitely gives us hope.
Yeah, definitely.
And I wonder too, Harriet, about the integration of these topics, that also is something that I think, you know, we're seeing the federal government see the connection between the infrastructure. You know, it's the joke that's going around that the infrastructure is so many more things than just roadways. And that misunderstanding, and that infrastructure touches so many more industries or so many more applications, so many more ways of implementation than just DOT, than just highways. And I wonder if that is a little bit of that, you know, as you pointed out, there isn't just the federal level of policy, there are all of these levels below. And perhaps that sort of integration that we're seeing at the federal level, maybe that also is something that can trickle down to state and then to local policymakers, of seeing the connection between where you put your roads and where you need your housing and where people work, you know, that sort of integration.
So what's interesting to me, like I would say, looking at this administration, looking at the American Jobs Plan, I would say there are three overriding issues, right? That are the focus of the plan. One is climate, right? Like knowing we have a narrowing window to avert permanent and catastrophic changes, and that we have a lot that we have to do, because for 4 years we haven't done anything, right? So there's a lot that has to happen on climate, and that includes the mitigation side as well as the adaptation side, because most of our communities are climate and risk blind. They don't know what their risks are. You know, they rely on FEMA flood maps that look only backward, right? Most of the damage in our modern disasters take place outside the map flood zone, right? Because our climate is getting more extreme. So climate is overriding, and growing disparity is overriding, and that both of those things cut across every program, right? So the third thing is a robust recovery from the pandemic and economic recovery, and that also means investing in the industries of the future, and continuing to disinvest in the industries of the past, and having policies that we haven't had in this country in decades, about shoring up particular industries, about really seeding R&D and really getting much more involved in investing in those industries, especially because it's become clear that we can't have battery operated anything if we can't get those elements, those rare earth metals and other things that are important part of batteries or other components like like computer chips. Then we're kind of stymied. So those are the cross-cutting issues. But the funny thing is infrastructure is the how. You know, they're basically saying we can make these investments. And let's be clear, you know, if we want to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, and we want to increase access so that people can have jobs and grow wealth, and we can reduce our disparities, it really means that infrastructure has to include things that enable people to come to work. That means we have to expand transit. That means we have to expand broadband. That means we have to have childcare. You know, we have to make sure schools are in good shape. So yeah, it's a whole bunch of things, but in some ways, oh no, this is the stuff that we've learned people need to be able to access the economy. So yeah, we got to invest in it. You know, that's yeah. So anyway, that's how I'm seeing it. It seems pretty clear. I would say if people get a chance to read the listen to the podcast, Ezra Klein with Brian Deese from about a week ago, it's really good, and it explains all of this kind of in a very good way. And I'll put in the chat. There was also a question. Maybe I'll put it in the Q&A so others can see it. I don't know where to put it, but there was a great article in the Post about how cities like Los Angeles are preparing, because even before there's any money from the American Jobs Plan, every agency is looking at their own discretionary funding and using that kind of criteria to put that money out there. So there's already opportunities to use this framing to compete for existing federal funds. So I'll try to put that in the chat or wherever you tell me to put it.
I think the chat is correct.
You know, it's interesting that you talked so much about climate. It's been, you know, I think there's certain cities that are in places like New York City, San Francisco, and Houston, where there is flooding and are going to come under increasing pressure, as you were saying, and so many others. And yet at the same time, they're probably all experiencing growth. And in the short term, it's a very difficult political conversation. Like you're saying, that knowledge of just what's going to happen after the year 2050 in some of these cities, how much land could be too risky to live on. It's not really out there. It's very difficult, I think, for elected officials to really lead, because going out and saying, well, your neighborhood might go underwater in the year 2050 does not get you elected. You know, it's you know, people need to be armed with data. So and in fact, you know, the opposite is happening. As there's these growing pressures of people to move into cities, there is more development in areas that are somewhat risky. Some cities are taking more progressive action to try and restrict that building than others, but a lot of people are saying, well, you can just put your building up on stilts and that'll solve everything, and that's not going to solve everything. So go ahead.
I think that's true. I think that most localities states too, they don't want to know what their climate risk is because they don't think they have the money to fix it. But in fact, if what we're doing with our existing capital budget is locking in for decades stuff in the wrong place that's vulnerable, stuff that increases the risk of properties that surround it, like that is a terrible mistake to be making. And so I think that you know, what if an agency using infrastructure money that had some amount of federal dollars in it, what if they were to have to certify that infrastructure will withstand the knowable risk through, let's say, 2050? You know, that would force people to actually do something about this. So I do think that I don't want to know is not gonna fly going forward, because it costs us too much. And the simplest thing to do is with land use. Land use is free to say, no, we're not going to develop here. Right. You know, we're going to prohibit that. And instead of doing that, the federal government has just come along behind with its you know, barrels of money to clean up the mess time after time. That can't go on. So anyway.
Yeah, that's one of my frustrations with this project, and I think we see it happening everywhere, is this is $4.9 billion for 8 miles. right? When we know it's not really going to solve climate change or congestion or anything else, you know, we need to be having a very different conversation about how we use these vast amounts of money to really prepare for the future instead of building the same thing over and over again.
So Mark and I worked, we both were involved a little bit. I got to do a wonderful thing in the Obama administration, which was run $1 billion national disaster resilience competition. But I think it's an interesting model for how the process of allocating federal dollars can be the very change we want to see with how those dollars get used. So, you know, that was a competition that took a year, a two-phase competition that had these things. It was around disaster recovery money, the last tranche of Sandy dollars. 48 states were eligible to compete with dozens of localities and territories. And the deal was that you had to, you had to know your risk and vulnerability, and you couldn't bring a project. You couldn't bring a 30-year-old project that everybody has hoping for federal funding to the competition. You had to only design an approach and demonstrate that you understood your risks and vulnerabilities and that you were bringing partners and funds. So that really changed a lot of things. And a ton of the projects that never got federal funding still went ahead because people had organized themselves to do a really amazing project, found the money, had the partners, and were able to go ahead. So I think that is the kind of thing that this administration needs to be doing as well to get the kind of change, that we're talking about.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see that type of series of academies happen again, maybe in a different format.
Exactly. And I'd love to play that role in my new job from the outside, because it would, that's what the federal government isn't necessarily good at all of these things. But you're an example of someone who was from the private sector who participated for free as a resource in those academies. But I also got 26 federal agencies to send people to those academies to teach people about, coastal risk, to be able to read NOAA's maps, to be able to talk to the Corps of Engineers about what might be feasible, all kinds of different expertise that you wouldn't normally be able to access in a single room.
Right. Right.
Well, and I think, Harriet, you made a point yesterday about the reframing of thinking and how that can focus work. I think that's something that, for thinking about members of CNU and the way that we want to embrace change and to affect change, those sorts of programs that can help collectively change thinking in a direction that is more productive, more efficient, is going to lead to outcomes that Urbanists are already seeking is a great sort of, step forward. It's something that can be momentum to help the sort of work that each of us, I was an urban designer for 20 years. We're working in our smaller pools, but seeing that sort of momentum and groundswell grow around the principles underlying the sort of work each of us might be trying to do is really the sort of impact that, for me, why I think designing for policy changes is such an important track, and why I think it's such an important approach to our work overall. And I note that we're here at the end of the hour, and I just wanted to give each of you sort of, a minute or two, if you had any final thoughts about the conversation today, about what you're looking forward to at the Congress, about what you're looking forward to in terms of the policy changes that you discussed today and that you're seeing on the horizon. I wanted to give you each a couple of minutes to just sort of reflect. And Harriet, maybe I'll start with you.
I'll be really brief since I've spoken so much in the last 15 minutes in particular, but I just think CNU is perfectly poised as the organization that is already multi-sectoral and that already looks across types of impacts and types of partners, and that every community is going to need this kind of leadership and inclusion that CNU members could really help to instigate. So I challenge everybody to, roll up their sleeves and get started on some projects thinking about this. Anything that is going to be going for any kind of federal funding, any piece of it that gets federal funding should be looking at this kind of an approach. Climate, economy, equity, all together.
Hayden, you want to go next?
Sure. I'll just say that, Congress is always a great place to learn from each other and hear creative solutions and band together and have great conversations. So, you know, I think that's, you know, we've got some really big issues to solve, and I would agree with Harriet that CNU is very well positioned to do that, and Congress is a great place to make those connections and learn more about what's going on in other places. So I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Hayden.
Yeah, I would echo that. You know, CNU is a great place where all these different disciplines that make up our communities have a chance to talk to each other and really coordinate. And just our conversation today has just, you know, has just reinforced how highways can connect to community land trusts and dealing with, you know, issues of displacement. It's fascinating. You know, I would just say what's also been interesting in CNU in urban planning is that what I started out as someone who really looked at the physical form of cities. Like it was just the highway transformation to a boulevard, or it was the form-based code. And now you see an opportunity to leverage funding that may come from some of these projects into, if you're dealing with neighborhoods that are already existing, how do you support the social infrastructure? That piece of it, you know, the actual people who are really making everything come alive. So I think that's really an opportunity out of all of this.
That's great, Mark. Well, I want to thank all three of you, Harriet, Hayden, and Mark. Thank you so much for this discussion today. I knew it would be lively and I could mostly hand it over to y'all, and you certainly did so. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to all of the sessions each of you are bringing to the Congress. I want to thank our audience for participating today and let everyone know that a recording of the session will be available on the CNU website. Within 24 hours, we get those up. And remind everyone to join us next Tuesday at noon Eastern time. We're going to have a similar session, but talking about design for physical change that I think will be just as robust and exciting. So with that, I want to thank everyone for their time today, and we'll see you next week on the park bench. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.